The old man walked slowly, his cane tapping against the cracked pavement as he made his way home. He was used to the stares, the whispers. This town had never been kind to people like him. But tonight felt different. The air was thick with something heavier than the summer heat. A group of men stood at the corner, their voices hushed but tense, eyes locked onto him like wolves spotting prey. He barely had time to react before they surrounded him. Accusations flew, lies wrapped in anger. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of experience. He had seen this before, lived through times when justice was just a word on paper. But they didn't care. Fists clenched, their hatred boiled over. A shove. A strike. Then, another. He stumbled, his cane slipping from his grasp as the world spun around him. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that this man wasn't alone. He had a son. A son who had spent years fighting battles far worse than this. A son who had learned not just how to defend, but how to destroy when necessary. And when that son got the call, when he heard the broken voice of the man who had raised him, everything changed. They thought they were dealing with an easy target. They had no idea what was coming. The old man lay on the cold pavement, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The mob stood over him, their fists clenched, their faces twisted with anger. Some of them wore smirks, others scowled, as if justifying to themselves why this was necessary. His cane had rolled away, landing in the gutter, useless. His ribs ached from the blows, his vision blurred, but he would not beg. He would not give them that satisfaction. One of the younger men stepped forward, his hoodie pulled low over his face. "You don't belong here," he spat, his voice sharp with hate. "People like you never did." The old man didn't respond. He knew words wouldn't change their minds. He had seen this kind of hate before decades ago, different faces, same cruelty. Back then, he had fought in ways they would never understand. He had marched, stood firm when others had fallen, refused to bow even when the world tried to break him. And yet, here he was again. The blows came harder this time, a boot to his stomach, a fist to his jaw. He barely registered the pain as his mind drifted elsewhere to his son. Miles away, the general sat in his office, his phone vibrating on the desk. He was a man known for his patience, his ability to remain calm in the most volatile situations. But when he saw the caller ID his father's number, something inside him shifted. The voice on the other end was weak, strained. "Son," the old man murmured, pain laced in every syllable. The general's fingers tightened around the phone. "Dad? Ted? What's wrong?" Silence stretched for a moment, then a soft, shaky breath. "They're trying to kill me." The line went dead. For a second, the general didn't move. His blood turned to ice, his heartbeat pounded in his ears. He had faced war, orchestrated missions that determined the fate of nations, but nothing had ever ignited this kind of fury inside him. His father, his rock, his hero was in danger. His second-in-command stepped into the room, mid-sentence about some briefing, but stopped cold at the look on his superior's face. "Sir?" The general stood, already grabbing his keys. "I need a jet. Now!" Back in the small town, the mob was growing restless. Some of them started shifting nervously, as if realizing the weight of what they were doing. Others, emboldened, egged each other on. "Teach him a lesson. No one's gonna miss him." The old man remained silent, his eyes searching the crowd. He could see hesitation in some of their faces. Not all of them had wanted to take it this far. Some had been swept up in the madness, afraid to back down. He recognized one of them, a boy from the neighborhood, barely out of his teens. He had seen him once playing basketball at the park, laughing with friends. Now that same boy stood frozen, fists clenched but not raised. The old man saw his chance. He locked eyes with the boy, forcing him to see the truth in this moment. "This isn't who you are," he rasped. "You still have a choice." The boy flinched, his shoulders tensing. One of the older men noticed and snarled, "Don't listen to him. He's just trying to get in your head." but it was already too late. Doubt had taken root. The boy took a step back, then another. He wasn't the only one. 2 others shuffled away, their eyes darting around as if just realizing what they had become. The leader of the group, the one who had thrown the first punch, turned to them in fury. "Cowards," he hissed. "You really think walking away makes you better than him?" The old man coughed, a sharp pain stabbing through his chest. "Better than you," he corrected, and despite everything, a small smile tugged at his lips. The leader's face twisted in rage. He raised his hand for another blow. But then, a sharp sound cut through the night. The distant roar of an engine, growing louder by the second. The mob turned their heads. Headlights pierced through the darkness as a sleek black SUV tore down the road, moving fast, too fast. It screeched to a halt mere feet away. The driver's door flew open. The general stepped out. His uniform was gone. He had no need for it now. Dressed in black, his stance was one of controlled fury. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the scene in an instant, assessing the damage, measuring every threat. And then he saw his father. Something inside him snapped. The mob hadn't fully registered what was happening yet. They only saw a man tall, imposing, but still just one man. One of them, foolish and arrogant, sneered. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" The general took a slow step forward. His voice was quiet, deadly. "The last mistake you'll ever make." The leader of the group scoffed, trying to mask his sudden unease. "Look, man, you don't wanna." But he never finished his sentence. The general moved faster than any of them could react. A single, precise strike bone met bone, and the leader crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath. The others stepped back, fear creeping into their expressions. "Leave," the general ordered, his voice like steel. "Now." Some of them obeyed instantly, scattering into the darkness like roaches when the light turns on. But a few hesitated, too prideful to back down. The general's hands clenched into fists. He had spent his life training soldiers, breaking men twice their size, dismantling entire organizations. These street thugs had no idea what kind of storm they had just unleashed. And tonight, he was done showing mercy. The night was far from over. The air was thick with tension, the streetlights casting long shadows over the scene. The general stood unmoving, his piercing gaze locked onto the men who still remained. A few had already fled into the darkness, but some held their ground, fists clenched, shoulders squared. They weren't ready to admit defeat, but deep down, they knew this was a fight they couldn't win. The leader groaned from the pavement, rolling onto his side, his breath ragged. He clutched his ribs where the general had struck him, eyes wild with disbelief. He had thought himself untouchable, a man feared in this town. But fear had shifted now. It wasn't on his side anymore. One of the men took a hesitant step back. "Man, this ain't worth it." The general tilted his head slightly, watching, calculating. He had spent years reading people, knowing when they were about to break. He could see it in their eyes the moment they realized they weren't in control anymore. A sharp cough from behind him made him turn. His father was still on the ground, struggling to sit up. For the first time since arriving, the general's cold fury cracked. He moved quickly, kneeling beside him. "Dad?" His voice was softer now, the steel replaced with something raw. His hands hovered over his father's bruised face, hesitant, as if afraid that touching him would somehow make it worse. The old man managed a weak chuckle. "Took you long enough." A tight smile ghosted over the general's lips, but his eyes burned with something deeper: guilt, rage, regret. He should have been here sooner. One of the remaining thugs shifted his weight. He was asking for it, he muttered under his breath, but there was no confidence in his words. Should kept his mouth shut. The general's gaze snapped to him so fast the man flinched. In 2 strides, he was in front of him, his presence overwhelming. The man barely reached for his pocket before the general grabbed his wrist in a crushing grip. "No," the general said, voice quiet but sharp as a blade. You should have walked away." The thug let out a sharp cry as the general twisted his arm, forcing him to his knees. He wasn't trying to break it just to remind him of what real power felt like. The others took the message loud and clear. They turned and ran, their footsteps fading into the night. Only the leader remained, still curled on the ground, watching with hatred burning in his eyes. The general stared down at him. "You're done here." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. "If I ever hear you came near him again." He let the words hang in the air, letting the unspoken promise settle deep in the man's bones. The leader swallowed hard, but didn't argue. He knew he had lost. With great effort, he stumbled to his feet and limped away into the night, his arrogance crushed beneath the weight of reality. Silence settled over the street, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. The general exhaled slowly, his anger still simmering but contained. He turned back to his father, helping him sit up fully. "We're going to the hospital." The old man shook his head. "I've had worse." The general's jaw clenched. "I don't care. You're getting checked out." With careful movements, he helped his father to his feet. The old man winced, but didn't protest. As they walked toward the SUV, the general cast one last glance at the empty street, making sure the threat was truly gone. They drove in silence for a while. The general's grip on the wheel was tight, his knuckles white. His father watched him from the passenger seat, studying the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders were locked like a coiled spring. Finally, the old man spoke. "You didn't have to come all this way, you know." The general's hands flexed against the wheel. "Don't say that." His father sighed. "Son." "No." The general cut him off, his voice low. "I should have been here." The old man studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "You have a life, responsibilities. You can't always be looking over my shoulder." The general didn't respond. He knew his father was trying to ease the guilt weighing on him, but it wasn't that simple. They arrived at the hospital, where a nurse took his father into a room for examination. The general sat in the waiting area, his knee bouncing with impatience. He had spent years waiting in war zones, strategizing under pressure, but this felt different. His mind raced with everything that had happened, with everything that could have gone differently. What if he hadn't picked up the phone? What if he had been too late? He closed his eyes, forcing himself to take a slow breath. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, you're his son, right?" The general opened his eyes to see a young woman standing nearby, one of the nurses. She looked nervous, hesitant. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. She shifted on her feet. I saw what happened. To your father." She hesitated before adding, "He's a good man. He's always been kind to everyone here." The general nodded. "I know." She looked down, twisting the fabric of her scrubs between her fingers. "People in this town, not all of us are like them." "I just thought you should know that." He studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." She offered a tight smile before walking away. Hours passed before the doctor came out, assuring him that his father would be fine, just bruised, sore, but strong as ever. When the general entered the hospital room, his father was already sitting up, looking far too amused for someone who had just been jumped. "They say I'm stuck here overnight," the old man said. "Ridiculous." The general smirked. "Doctor's orders." His father rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Instead, he tilted his head, studying his son. "You always did have a temper," he mused. "Even as a boy." The general sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Dad, you think I don't know what you are thinking out there?" The old man interrupted, his tone gentler now. "I saw it in your eyes. You wanted to do worse." The general didn't deny it. He had wanted to. Every instinct in his body had told him to tear those men apart. His father reached out, resting a hand on his arm. "But you didn't." The general exhaled slowly. It wasn't about holding back. He met his father's gaze. It was about knowing when to stop. The old man smiled. That's what makes you different from them. Silence stretched between them, comfortable now. The general leaned back in the chair, his body finally relaxing. I'm moving you out of here, he said. You're coming with me. The old man chuckled. Bossing me around already? I'm serious. The general's expression hardened. I don't trust this place. His father studied him for a long moment before nodding. All right, Relief washed over the general, though he didn't say it out loud. They sat there in quiet understanding, father and son, knowing that while the battle wasn't over, they had won the most important fight of all survival. And in the end, that was what truly mattered.